When we look back at cases from early in our modern criminal justice system, we're sometimes shocked by the errors made by law enforcement, and by how things that would have been seen as red flags today went unnoticed by people of the past. Without reliable methods and quality forensic science, whims sent investigators on wild goose chases. And these chases were often racially motivated. This week on Out of the Past, the abduction and murder of Elsie Paroubek. In 1895, Elsie's parents moved to Chicago from the Czeslaw district of Bohemia in what used to be Austria-Hungary. The area is in the modern Czech Republic. 11 years and 6 children later, František and Karolina Paroubek welcomed a baby girl named Eliška, whom they lovingly nicknamed Elsie. It had been Frank's dream to raise his family in the United States ever since he'd visited as a teenager, and the dream was coming true. Even if he had to work long hours as a painter, his children were growing up attending quality schools, and he was proud of the future he'd made available for his family. František, Frank, supported 5 children on 1 income while Karolina stayed home to take care of the children. Times were tight, but they had a great community of Czech immigrants, including some relatives that could help them should the need arise. They appreciated their situation. It was like they had a tiny Czech Republic in the middle of Chicago. Everything changed on April 8, 1911. Elsie told her mother that she wanted to go visit her aunt, who lived just a short distance away. It being 1911, Elsie's mother didn't think twice about letting her go. Elsie ran into her cousin halfway through the journey, and they both stopped to listen to an organ grinder on the street for a few minutes. Music was more of a novelty back then. People rarely got to listen to it unless it was being played live, so of course the children stopped to listen. Reportedly, when the organ grinder moved to the next corner, the rest of the children moved along with him. Now, there are 2 different versions of this story that appear in the media. In one, the organ grinder kept moving, and eventually the other children lost interest. Even Elsie's cousin Josie left. Elsie was left alone with the organ grinder. In another version of the story, Elsie lost interest in the music before the rest of the children and was left behind as the organ grinder made his way down the street. Either way, nobody ever saw Elsie alive again. Her mother, Karolina, took quite a long time to actually realize her daughter was missing. Hours later, she visited her sister's home to see how things were going, but Karolina's sister informed her that Elsie had never arrived at her house. This didn't seem to worry her. Karolina assumed her 5-year-old was off playing and would come home eventually. By the time the sun set, Frank began to lose it. Karolina thought it was possible that she was simply staying at a friend's house, but understandably, Frank was too uncomfortable not knowing where his 5-year-old was, and contacted the authorities. Astonishingly, the cops told him he was overreacting and told him to come back if she hadn't returned by morning. A 5-year-old! Obviously, morning came and went without any sign of Elsie, and an enormous search effort began. The story was heavily covered in the press, although most of the time they used anglicized versions of the people's names. Paroubek was changed to Paroubek. In fact, they changed some of the names completely, which I don't really understand. Did they think that Americans wouldn't connect with foreign-sounding names? They even go so far as calling Karolina Mary and Frank John or Peter, which seems really strange to me as the name Frank was already popular in the United States at the time. In order to be more understandable, I will be using the anglicized pronunciation Paroubek for the rest of this video. Anti-Ziganism is an issue that a lot of Americans are unfamiliar with. In most places in Europe, there is a lot of racism towards the Romani people, commonly referred to with the slur Gypsy. When Elsie went missing, Frank had tunnel vision. There was a stereotype at the time that the nomadic Roma people coveted little girls with light hair and blue eyes, and would often kidnap them. Actually, this stereotype exists to this day. If you'll recall, one of the major theories in the Madeleine McCann case from 2007 was that she'd been taken by gypsies. Several Romani families with lighter-skinned children were questioned and harassed. I'll talk more in a moment about what caused Frank's fears, but what's important to understand about this part of the story is that no other theory ever entered Frank Paroubek's mind. He was completely driven by racism, and ultimately, I think that's one of the reasons this case remains unsolved. A few years earlier, another young girl had gone missing. Her name was Lillian Wolfe, and she had been taken by a couple that were quite possibly not Romani at all. She was lured by the female in the relationship with the promise of candy. The nomadic couple took the child on the road, and it wasn't until they arrived in Momence, Illinois, that a nosy farmer suspected something was wrong. Lillian had no shoes. Her clothes were ill-fitting. She wasn't dressed appropriately for the weather. He asked the child her name, and she told him. He immediately realized that she was the missing girl from Chicago. The media labeled the couple as gypsies to make the story more salacious. In reality, the couple who had taken Lillian were simply predators with a history of child abduction. He was a pedophile with a wife who was willing to procure victims for him. So, even if he was in fact Roma, his culture wasn't what led to the kidnapping of these girls. It was his perversion and his lack of respect for human life. Both he and his wife were found guilty of kidnapping and sentenced to decades in jail. Convinced by Frank's certainty, law enforcement began to look into several gypsy families. They knew Lillian's story, they believed the stereotypes, and a child eyewitness had even claimed to have seen a crying child in the back of a gypsy wagon on the day Elsie disappeared. So law enforcement put a great deal of its resources into investigating the theory. The police were called on several Romani families simply because they had light-skinned daughters. People read the papers and believed the theory to be true, so they were essentially spying on various Romani families to try to help find the girl. The $50 reward offered by Frank Paroubek made amateur sleuths even more ambitious. But every Romani girl that was reported to law enforcement turned out to be a dead end. None of these girls were Elsie. Convinced by the rumors, Lillian Wolfe herself offered to help law enforcement in their search. She told the police that Elsie would be required to beg to bring home income, and if she didn't obtain enough, she'd be beaten. Lillian led a search party down the same road her nomadic kidnappers had taken, but the search was fruitless. We should emphasize here that the police were trying to learn more about gypsy culture and how they treated their children. In reality, Lillian only knew how the particular predators who kidnapped her behaved. But her words nonetheless helped perpetuate negative stereotypes about the Romani people. Law enforcement also consulted the man who kidnapped Lillian, William Jones. He couldn't provide information, but he suggests they ask the Gypsy King if they really thought they had taken her. Taking his advice, they arrested Elijah George, representative for the Romani people, or the Gypsy King, in Argyle, Wisconsin, on kidnapping charges. George had no information, and they eventually had to let him go. Even though absolutely none of these lines of investigation provided any new information, the police continued on their narrow course. Frank Petrovic met with a psychic who told him Elsie was in Argo, Wisconsin. That sounded enough like Argyle for the police, so they once again began to harass Elijah George and the Romani people there. Again, nothing came from this investigation. Finally, after spending a great deal of energy on the gypsy theory and harassing multiple families and caravans, law enforcement began looking for other leads. A worry that she'd fallen into the river prompted them to drag the river with nets. They found nothing. Eventually, everyone was looking for Elsie constantly. Chicago School Superintendent Ella Young asked all the school children to use their Easter break to help search for her. The community poured everything into the search. Local Czech organizations contributed to the effort, and the Bohemian Charitable Organization put up a $500 reward. Many others assisted by providing resources or contributing to the reward fund. But police were almost certain at this point that Elsie would not be returning home alive. George Scully, an electrical engineer who worked at the Lockport power plant, noticed something unusual as he looked out over the nearby canal one day. He and some other co-workers decided to investigate and remove the object from the water. To their horror, it became clearer and clearer what the object was as they grew closer. It was the body of a child, a little girl. Fully aware of the situation with Elsie, they contacted the authorities immediately. Lieutenant Costello of the local police force thought it was a possibility that she'd been playing on the edge and had fallen into the canal and drowned. William Gooddale was the first coroner to examine the body. He was pretty certain of her identity, but he still had to bring in Frank Paroubek for a formal identification. The body was barely recognizable as it had been deteriorating in the water for some time. Because of facial decomposition, Frank was unable to provide a positive ID. He passed the task on to Elsie's mother, Carolina. The child's mother knew her child. It was Elsie. She had no doubt. Frank insisted to authorities that his daughter had been murdered before medical examiners were able to conclusively rule the death a homicide. He turned out to be correct. It was not an accident. She didn't drown. There wasn't any water in her lungs. Elsie had either been strangled or suffocated, and different doctors had differing opinions about whether she was sexually assaulted. Several doctors determined that she absolutely had been abused, while others argued that there was no evidence. But remember, the body had been in the water for some time, so any evidence of fluids from sexual assault would have been washed away. The newspapers didn't say the word raped. They used the word attacked. Publishers felt the need to censor the atrocities that Elsie experienced to spare their readers' tender sensibilities. After the autopsy, some detectives gave up on the gypsy theory. They understood that they were in all likelihood looking for a dangerous pedophile. While medical examiners disagreed on some findings, one piece of information was consistent across reports. Elsie had been ruthlessly murdered. The doctors also thought that there was no way that Elsie's body had been in the water for more than 14 days, meaning that she was either buried elsewhere or kept alive and abused for 2 whole weeks before her death. The police couldn't continue to move forward with the anti-Ziganist line of investigation. There were actual suspects out there that they had been ignoring. Starting just days after Elsie disappeared, the Paroubeks started receiving some alarming mail. Unable to read the English himself, Frank asked a friend for help reading the letter. The man didn't want to help him understand the letter, as it essentially said, "Your daughter is gone because you're a bad father." That wasn't the only letter. Others arrived, and some details in the letters led authorities to believe that the author may have been involved in the crime. The police tried to investigate, but when they asked Frank for the letters, he revealed that he'd already burned them. With a lack of evidence, authorities were never able to identify the author of the letters. A ransom note was received by the Paroubeks, demanding $500 for their daughter's return. This, unfortunately, turned out to be a cruel hoax. The police also received letters. One of them claimed that the author had seen Elsie walking down the canal that morning with a young adult man. Police deduced that this must have been Joseph Konechty, a salesman who lived near the canal. Konechty had immigrated to Chicago from the same area the Paroubeks came from. They interviewed Konechty's landlord, and she provided some suspicious information. When they asked her if she'd seen Elsie around, the woman indicated that Konechty very much enjoyed the company of prepubescent girls, and often had girls over. But Konechty was gone. The landlady had kicked him out. His possessions were still in his apartment, however, and the police were able to search for evidence. Oddly, they found a large amount of children's clothing in the home. Konechty had no children of his own. It wouldn't attract a glance if a peddler was carting around large sacks. Sacks large enough to hide a small child in. And authorities found sacks this size in the apartment. Additionally, a patch of disturbed earth caught the eye of police. In the dirt, they found a green ribbon. Elsie was said to have been wearing a green ribbon the day that she disappeared. Their suspicions ran wild, but they were never able to question Konechty as he threw himself in front of a train just a month after Elsie was kidnapped. Law enforcement dropped Konechty as a suspect altogether after his death. They just stopped investigating and never explained why he dropped off the suspect list. On the 13th of May, the body of a young man was found about 20 miles from where Elsie's body had been recovered. This became the new suspect for police, but they couldn't really do much investigating with their suspect already deceased. The suspect was also a John Doe. Police could not find any identification on the body. The only paperwork on him was a Polish Catholic prayer card. Police were unable to attach any meaning to the words written on the card. The words Sig and Hoff had been handwritten on the card. These are not Polish words. Hoff could mean hope in German, or maybe it's someone's name. Regardless, nothing ever came of this investigation, and authorities never revealed why this John Doe was a suspect. A mentally ill religious fanatic named Kinsella, who lived near the canal, was also looked at as a person of interest. This was another suspect who was never interviewed, as he refused to speak. A police chase ensued, and after a 3.5-mile chase on foot, Kinsella escaped. He also dropped off the suspect list for reasons that were never revealed. Police seemed to drop every suspect that showed promise. Frank and Carolina Paroubek were furious, and the community felt their pain. Elsie's funeral was an enormous event, attended by 2,000 to 3,000 people. Chicago residents were heartbroken that the girl they all pulled together to search for didn't make it. Everyone wanted to pay their respects. Without any further developments in the case, Frank's mental health began to deteriorate. He passed away on the 2nd anniversary of Elsie's funeral. Elsie's family lived in grief, never learning what happened to their little girl. Then, in 1973, just after his death, Henry Darger appeared on the radar as a possible suspect for this decades-old case. Darger was a writer, and his works are horrifying. He wrote only of tortured little girls. He worked as a custodian at a Catholic hospital and spent much of his adult life in isolation, not caring for the company of others. Neighbors caught a glimpse of him only on rare occasions. Interestingly, these same neighbors said they often heard more than one voice coming from Darger's apartment, and it was usually an angry one, an angry woman berating him. But there wasn't anyone else inside his apartment. Darger had to have been doing all the talking himself. He kept a diary as a child, and its contents were disturbing, to say the least. He had a lot of hate built up inside of him. He was angry. Specifically, he was angry at little girls. Inside the diary, there are stories of him threatening to hurt other children with knives or throwing ashes into the eyes of small girls. With his mother dead and his father ill, Henry Darger was sent to a boarding school. There, he was severely disliked by both the adults and the other children. He received corporal punishment for his bad and violent behavior and was eventually expelled. After being caught masturbating, Darger was sent to an asylum where he was severely abused until he escaped at the age of 16. After moving to Chicago and taking a job as a custodian, Darger had the idea to create a children's protection society to keep children from being mistreated. He wanted to become a father himself, but adoption agencies didn't find him fit to raise children, and this devastated him. He spent the rest of his life focusing on fictional children. He wrote a 15,000-page fantasy novel about little girls, whom he called the Vivian Girls. The book is about 7 princesses protected by dragon-type animals called blengans. The citizens of the world enslave children, and the princesses are their only hope. A race of adults, the Glandolinians, torture and oppress the children. The book tells stories of child rebellions from years past, and one particular martyr is very important to the book. A child martyr named Annie Ehrenberg. The child martyr, Annie Ehrenberg, is based on Elsie Paroubek. His novel wasn't successful. What did eventually gain a lot of attention were the hundreds of watercolor illustrations that went along with the book. He didn't feel that he had the talent to draw little girls' faces, so he would cut images from magazines and newspapers and paste them onto his watercolor landscapes. He would often color in their eyes with pencil to make them shine. Darger kept lots of pictures of little girls in his work locker. He also had piles and piles in his home. About 1 year after Elsie was murdered, Darger's favorite picture went missing. This drove him crazy, and he obsessed over finding it. The picture was of Elsie Paroubek. Losing this picture changed the plot of his book and prompted him to create some of his most disturbing art. In his fantasy novel, it was said that the war would never end until the photograph was found. That is, until Elsie/Annie appears as a spirit and lets them know that they need to move on. Then the children can win the war. Since almost no one knew about Darger's project and his obsession with Elsie before his death, the police never considered him a suspect. He died in 1973. His landlords found his work while he was hospitalized, and it didn't take long for it to draw the attention of the art world. He is now widely recognized as one of the most famous outsider artists in the world, and he is frequently referred to in popular music, art, and literature. Perhaps the most famous examples are the rock band The Vivian Girls and John Ashbery's book-length poem, Girls on the Run. His art was creepy as hell, and I definitely would use caution if you Google it. He created many scenes of the torture and murder of little girls, some of them extremely graphic. The girls were often naked, and he sometimes drew penises on them. So, this is all very weird, but it doesn't actually provide us with any information about Elsie. He was obsessed with her photograph, yes, but that doesn't mean he was involved with her murder. I find this guy terrifying, and it wouldn't surprise me if he was a dangerous pedophile, but I really think it's just a coincidence that he happened to cut Elsie's picture out for his collection. The fact that it became his favorite? Also coincidence. To this day, the murder of Elsie Paroubek has never been solved. And I blame that heavily on the anti-Ziganist turn the investigation took at the beginning. Anti-Ziganism runs rampant to this day. When I was an undergraduate studying abroad in Eastern Europe, I once saw a white man slap a small Romani child across the face because he was begging for money in a Baskin-Robbins. Everyone else in the store acted like it was normal. Attitudes like this can make people single-minded when it comes to investigation. In the Paroubek's instance, if the police had not been distracted by Frank's tunnel vision, they could have done things differently. If they had worked faster and more discreetly, they could have spoken to Koneshti before his suicide. They might have been able to get Kinsella if they had tried to catch him again, but they just dropped it. I obviously can't speak with a lot of certainty, as this case is over 100 years old, but I think that Koneshti and Kinsella were both interesting suspects. Koneshti's story particularly gives me the creeps. It's regrettable that police didn't continue their investigations into these men. I'm also interested to know if they looked into the organ grinder. According to one version of the story, he was the last person who saw her, after all. This has been a hard case to research. Elsie Paroubek was a bright little girl who was thrown into the canal like a piece of trash. It turns my stomach. It demonstrates a complete lack of value for human life. If this story has moved you to action, please consider donating to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. They are always out there helping kids, and your donation can make a difference. That's all for this week. Stay home, stay safe, give me a thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll see you next time on Out of the Past. In celebration of reaching a subscriber goal, I am going to be doing a giveaway this week. Please leave a comment below, a nice comment, and you will be entered to win an Out of the Past t-shirt. I will contact you and get you your prize.